Fine, let's start. Number 1. The Pień padlocked vampire. In the year 2022, on a quiet stretch of farmland at Pień, near Dąbrowa Chełmińska in northern Poland, a team from Nicolaus Copernicus University in Toruń opened a grave that stopped them cold. The dig was led by Professor Dariusz Poliński of the Institute of Archaeology. What lay in the soil was the skeleton of an adult woman, buried sometime in the 17th century, but she had not been laid to rest like her neighbors. An iron sickle had been placed across her throat, the curved blade following the line of her neck. The intention was simple and chilling. If the body ever tried to sit up, the blade would catch the throat and stop it. That was not the only safeguard. Around the big toe of her left foot, the gravediggers had fastened a small iron padlock. Think about what that means. A lock on a corpse. In the folk belief of this region, the padlock closed a stage of life and bound the dead in place, so the person could not return. The sickle restrained the body. The lock restrained the spirit. Together, they form one of the most vivid anti-revenant burials ever excavated. This was not a churchyard. It was a settlement cemetery, the kind of ground sometimes used for people who fell outside the comfortable center of a community. In the folklore of Central Europe, certain dead were thought to rise again as the upior, a returning corpse. Suicides, the unbaptized, and those who simply seemed different in life were the ones most feared. The sickle laid across the soft tissue of the throat is the single clearest signature archaeologists use to identify these burials. The find drew headlines around the world in September of 2022. Samples went off for ancient DNA and isotope analysis to reconstruct the woman's diet, her origins, and her health. And the site kept giving. In 2023, the same team reported another grave nearby, a child buried face down with a padlock under the foot. The researchers were careful to stress that these graves are not curiosities. They are records of real fear and real grief. So why would an entire community in the supposedly enlightened 17th century lock a dead woman into the earth? To answer that, we have to travel back much further, into the heart of the Roman Empire. Number 2. The Sagalassos nailed and sealed grave. High in the Taurus Mountains of southwestern Turkey lie the ruins of Sagalassos, a Roman city in the ancient region of Pisidia. For decades, a Belgian team from KU Leuven has carefully excavated it. Among their discoveries is a grave that overturns a comfortable assumption. We like to imagine that fear of the walking dead belonged to remote villages and dark forests. But here, in a sophisticated, literate Roman city, the dead were sealed in with extraordinary care. The grave dates to around the middle of the 3rd century of the Common Era. The person inside had been cremated where they lay, a practice called a busta cremation, rather than being burned elsewhere and moved. That alone was unusual, but around and over the burned remains, the gravediggers scattered roughly 41 iron nails, and these nails had been deliberately bent and twisted. In Roman magic, bending a nail was a way to fix a danger in place, to neutralize it. The same bent nails turn up on Roman curse tablets across the empire. Then came the sealing. Over the cremated remains, the Romans laid a course of brick tiles, building a lid above the dead. And over those tiles, they spread a layer of lime plaster. Count the measures: burning the body in place, pinning it with dozens of bent nails, capping it with tiles, sealing it under plaster. That is at least 3 independent attempts to keep something contained. The lead researcher, Johann Kleis of KU Leuven, published the find in the journal Antiquity in 2023 and interpreted it as a response to fear of the restless, unquiet dead. The grave sat inside the city itself, near a building that had been destroyed, not out in a formal cemetery. There were no rich grave goods. This was not about honoring the dead. It was about containment. The Romans had their own malevolent spirits, the lemurs and the larvae, the troublesome dead who could haunt the living. Lime plaster did have a practical sanitizing role, which is the mainstream archaeological reading, but the deliberately bent nails point to something beyond hygiene. They point to belief. Whether the community feared a specific cursed individual or simply followed established magical ritual, the result is the same. They built a tomb to keep someone in, and the Greeks, a few centuries earlier, had done the same. Number 3. The Kamarina Passo Marinaro Necrophobia burials. On the southern coast of Sicily stood Kamarina, a Greek colony founded by the city of Syracuse around 599 before the Common Era. Just outside it lay a vast cemetery called Passo Marinaro, named for a locality near the ancient harbor. It was in use from roughly the 5th to the 3rd centuries before the Common Era, and held around 2,900 burials. Most were ordinary. 2 were not. The bioarchaeologist Carrie Solosky Weaver of the University of Pittsburgh studied these graves and identified clear evidence of necrophobia, the fear of the dead. In one grave, an adult had been pinned beneath large fragments of broken amphorae, the heavy ceramic shards stacked deliberately over the head and the feet. The weight was not decoration. It was restraint, meant to trap the body and stop it from rising. In a second grave, a child had been weighed down by several heavy rocks placed over the body. To understand this, we have to step inside the Greek mind. The Greeks had specific categories for the dangerous dead. There were the biothanatoi, those who died violent deaths, and the aoroi, the untimely dead, taken before their proper time. Such souls were thought to be restless, unable to settle, and capable of troubling the living. By piling weight on the head and feet, the people of Kamarina were physically embodying a belief that the corpse could move. Disease, deformity, or a strange death may have marked these particular individuals as risks. What makes Kamarina so important is its age. These weighted burials are among the oldest clear archaeological evidence anywhere for the fear that the dead might return. They predate the Christian world and the famous early modern vampire burials by more than 1,000 years. The reuse of amphorae as a grave covering is otherwise common in the Greek world, so it is the specific placement, sealing the head and feet, that betrays the intent. The population of Kamarina itself was a genetic mixture of Greek settlers and indigenous Sicilians, a blended community living and dying together. Whether their fear was directed at the violent dead, at funerary pollution they called miasma, or at a specific source of disease, we cannot fully know. What we do know is that the impulse to seal the dead in the ground runs far deeper in time than most people imagine. From classical Greece, that impulse spread along the shores of the Black Sea. Number 4. The Sozopol iron-staked skeletons. Most people, when they hear the word vampire, picture a wooden stake through the heart. That image feels like fiction. But on the Black Sea coast of Bulgaria, in the ancient town of Sozopol, founded long ago as the Greek colony of Apollonia Pontica, archaeologists found the real thing in the year 2012. 2 skeletons lay in the earth, each with a heavy iron rod driven straight through the chest. The discovery was announced by Božidar Dimitrov, then the director of Bulgaria's National History Museum, and it made headlines across the world. The burials are usually dated to roughly the 13th or 14th centuries. The implement hammered through the torso was not a carved wooden stake, but an iron plowshare or a similar heavy farming tool, aimed at the region of the heart. The purpose was to pin the corpse to the grave so that it could never rise as a vampire. Bulgaria is one of the true heartlands of the vampire belief. More than 100 such staked burials are known from the country. Many of the staked individuals were men who had been considered wicked or dangerous in life. Some Bulgarian burials show other measures too, like the removal of teeth or the pinning of limbs. The belief behind it was specific. If a demon entered a body before burial, the corpse could become a vampire, and only iron through the heart could stop it. Iron itself carried power in this worldview. Across many cultures, iron was thought to bind and repel the supernatural, which is why the same metal turns up again and again in these graves. And here is a detail that complicates the simple picture. Christianity was the official faith, yet these folk rites continued, and clergy themselves sometimes took part in anti-vampire practices. The two worlds, church and folklore, lived side by side. Sozopol was a true crossroads, a place where Greek, Thracian, Roman, and later Slavic traditions all met and mingled over many centuries. The vampire burials of Bulgaria span hundreds of years, peaking in the medieval and post-medieval eras. Was this organized folk ritual against a feared corpse, a form of social control against dangerous people, or a desperate response to real outbreaks of disease blamed on the dead? Most likely, it was all three at once. What the Sozopol graves prove is that the literary vampire has roots in hard archaeology, and the engine driving much of this fear was disease, a force we see most clearly in the grave of a single Italian child. Number 5. The Vampire of Lugnano Child. In the Umbrian countryside of central Italy lies a place with a heartbreaking name, La Necropoli dei Bambini, the Cemetery of the Babies, at Lugnano in Teverina. It dates to around 450 of the Common Era, in the twilight of the Roman world, and it was attached to an abandoned Roman villa. This was a burial ground set aside almost entirely for infants and very young children. The excavations were directed by David Soren of the University of Arizona, who had worked the site since the late 1980s. Then, in 2018, the team uncovered a burial that changed everything. It was a child of about 10 years old, the oldest individual in the entire cemetery, and someone had deliberately wedged a stone into the child's mouth, forcing it between the jaws. The researchers interpreted it the way the evidence demands. They believed this child might rise from the grave and spread disease, and the stone was meant to stop it. That fear had a real cause. The cemetery is tied to a devastating malaria epidemic. Ancient DNA from the site confirmed the presence of Plasmodium falciparum, the deadliest malaria parasite in the population. This child showed an abscessed tooth, possibly linked to the disease. The little cemetery was a place where a community buried its smallest victims of an invisible killer they could not understand, and the burials were soaked in ritual. Around the graves, archaeologists found raven talons, the bones of toads, bronze cauldrons, and the sacrificed remains of puppies. These are the tools of magic, of rites meant to ward off evil. The community was fighting back against the epidemic with every weapon it had, including ritual control of the dead. The stone forced into the child's mouth closely resembles a belief that would echo through Europe for 1,000 more years: the fear of corpses that chew and feed in the grave. The child of Lugnano became known as the Vampire of Lugnano, though of course there was no monster here, only a sick and frightened community and a dead child. What the site reveals is the moment necrophobia and epidemic disease lock together. When people cannot see a germ, they look for a cause they can touch, and sometimes that cause is the dead themselves. This connection between disease and the sealed grave would be tested, centuries later, with the full force of modern science in a Polish village called Drawsko. Number 6. The Drawsko Sickle Burials. In northwestern Poland lies the village of Drawsko, with a cemetery used in the 17th and 18th centuries. Within its grounds, archaeologists found a series of anti-vampire burials, and these graves became the setting for one of the most rigorous scientific investigations of necrophobia ever attempted. The work was led by Leslie Gregorica of the University of South Alabama and colleagues who published their results in the journal PLOS One in 2014. Out of around 285 graves, 6 individuals had received deviant treatment. Iron sickles had been placed across their throats, or across the abdomen and hips. A sickle across the neck served the same grim purpose as at Pień. If the corpse tried to rise, the blade would decapitate it. Some of these individuals also had a stone placed under or against the chin or throat, another method of restraint. For a long time, scholars assumed that suspected vampires were outsiders, strangers, migrants who did not belong, and so were feared after death. Gregorica's team decided to test that idea directly, using strontium isotope analysis. The chemistry of the teeth records the geology of the place where a person grew up. If the deviant burial individuals were foreigners, their isotope signatures would differ from the locals. The result was striking. They were local. These were not strangers. They were the community's own people. That single finding overturned a long-standing assumption. If the feared dead were not outsiders, then why were they singled out? The researchers proposed a compelling answer. They may have been the first victims of an epidemic, possibly cholera. In a pre-scientific world, the first person to die in an outbreak could be blamed as the source, the one who would call the others into the grave behind them. Both men and women, across a range of ages, received the sickle treatment. The sickle, like the plowshare in Bulgaria, was an everyday agricultural tool, suddenly transformed into a supernatural restraint. The Drawsko study is celebrated because it combined three things: the careful study of bones, the chemistry of isotopes, and the record of folklore, into a single argument. It reflects the wider Slavic and Central European dread of the upior, and it reframed the whole subject. These were not despised exiles. They were neighbors, feared not for who they were in life, but for how and when they died. The same logic that blocking the body could stop a returning corpse appears across the sea in medieval Ireland. Number 7. The Kilteasheen mouth-stoned skeletons. Near Lough Key, in County Roscommon, Ireland, sits a site called Kilteasheen. Between 2005 and 2009, a team led by Chris Reed of the Institute of Technology in Sligo, with Thomas Finan of St. Louis University, excavated the ground there. They uncovered around 137 skeletons, out of a possible 3,000 estimated to lie at the site. 2 of those skeletons told a disturbing story. They were both adult men, and each had a large stone forced into his mouth. The stones had been pushed in with such force that the jaws were dislocated. This was no accident of burial. It was a deliberate ritual act. Remarkably, the 2 men did not die in the same era. One burial dates to roughly the 8th century of the Common Era, and the other to the 12th or 13th century. The same practice persisted across the site for many generations. The reason behind it lies in medieval belief about the soul and the body. Many people held that the soul could leave and re-enter the body through the mouth. By blocking the mouth with a heavy stone, the living could trap the soul inside, or prevent the corpse from doing what revenants were thought to do, returning to feed. These men were not buried with marks of high status. The entire focus of their burial was containment. Kilteasheen sits within an early Christian and medieval landscape, and these are sometimes called the earliest Irish examples of revenant prevention burial. The revenant, the reanimated corpse, haunted the medieval imagination long before the literary vampire was ever written down. English chroniclers such as William of Newburgh recorded similar tales of the restless dead rising from their graves to torment the living, and described communities digging up and destroying the bodies. Chris Reed was clear that the placement of the stones was a ritual choice, a conscious effort to keep these men in the ground. What makes the site so valuable is the span of time it covers, showing that the belief was not a brief panic, but a durable part of the culture. It connects Irish folk tradition to a much wider medieval European world of revenant fear, a world that stretched east into the Slavic lands, where the practice reached its most extreme and concentrated form in a single cemetery in Bohemia. Number 8. The Čelákovice Deviant Cemetery. Near the city of Prague, in what is now the Czech Republic, lies the town of Čelákovice. In the 1960s, Archaeologists discovered a cemetery there that remains one of the most extreme anti-vampire sites in all of Europe. It dates to roughly the 10th and 11th centuries of the Common Era in early medieval Bohemia, a time when the region was shifting from paganism toward Christianity. What sets it apart is not a single strange grave, but the sheer concentration of them. Of the burials at the site, somewhere around 11 to 14 individuals had received deviant treatment, an astonishing proportion, and the methods used were the most aggressive known anywhere. Bodies had been decapitated, their skulls removed and placed between the legs, or otherwise repositioned away from the neck. Several individuals were buried face down, in the prone position, so that if they woke, they would be disoriented and dig the wrong way. Heavy stones were placed on top of bodies to pin them to the earth. Some had their limbs bound, weighted, or staked. The people who received this treatment were predominantly young adult men. The unusual clustering strongly suggests this was not a series of isolated incidents, but an organized community response. Some scholars believe the cemetery may have served as a dedicated burial ground for the dangerous dead, a place set apart specifically for those the community feared. Slavic folklore is rich with the revenant, known in this region as the upir, the ancestor of the word vampire itself. The decapitation and repositioning seen at Čelákovice is among the most thorough containment ever documented. To behead a corpse and place the skull beyond its reach was to make movement impossible. To then pin it with stones or turn it face down was to pile method upon method. There is also debate about whether some of these individuals were executed criminals or social outcasts rather than feared revenants, and the truth may blend the two. A criminal in life could easily be feared as a monster in death. Čelákovice is cited again and again, alongside the Polish and Bulgarian sites, as core evidence for the archaeology of necrophobia. It anchors the practice firmly in the Western Slavic world and shows it at its most intense. Here, multiple containment methods were combined in grave after grave, the work of a community gripped by collective fear. That fear, though, reaches its most famous expression not in a quiet cemetery, but in the mass graves of a plague-stricken city, on a small island in the lagoon of Venice. Number 9. The Venice Plague Shroud-eater. In the Venetian lagoon sits a small island called Lazaretto Nuovo, which served the great city as a quarantine station during outbreaks of plague. Beneath it lie mass graves, and within one of them, linked to the terrible plague of 1576, archaeologists found a skull that became world famous. In 2006, a team led by Matteo Borini, then of the University of Florence, excavated the remains of an older woman and saw that someone had forced a brick between her jaws. The brick was not random. It was aimed at a specific kind of monster, the shroud-eater, known in German tradition as the Nachtzerer. People believed that certain corpses chewed on their own burial shrouds in the grave, and that this gnawing spread the plague to the living, almost as if the dead were eating their way through the world. Forcing a brick or stone into the mouth was meant to stop the chewing, and so halt the epidemic at its source. Borini published the case in the Journal of Forensic Sciences in 2010, and it was reported as possibly the first forensic record of a so-called vampire exorcism. Why would anyone believe a corpse was eating its shroud? The answer lies in the natural process of decay, misread by frightened eyes. As a body decomposes, gases bloat it. Fluids called purge fluid can seep from the mouth and look like fresh blood, and the burial shroud can sink and tear over the face, appearing to have been chewed. Gravediggers reopening these mass pits to add new bodies would encounter corpses at exactly these stages, and draw the only conclusion their worldview allowed. The plague of 1576 was catastrophic, killing a vast share of Venice's population, including the great painter Titian. In the face of such mass death, with no understanding of bacteria, the brick in the mouth was a desperate attempt to control the uncontrollable. The shroud-eater belief is documented in German and Slavic sources of the period, showing how widely the idea had spread. What makes the Venice case so haunting is where it sits in history. It stands at the very edge of the modern world, in an era when scholars like Girolamo Fracastoro were beginning to theorize about contagion. The brick in the woman's mouth is folk magic and the dawn of epidemiology, side by side in a single grave. It remains perhaps the most famous individual vampire burial ever found, and yet, for all its drama, the most common way humans sealed their dead was far simpler and far more widespread. Number 10. Prone, face-down burials worldwide. Of all the methods used to seal the dead, one stands above the rest in sheer reach across time and space. It is also the simplest. Prone burial means laying the body face down in the grave instead of the normal position on the back. It required no special tools, no iron, no stone, only a deliberate reversal of the usual practice. And it appears almost everywhere humans have buried their dead. Prone burials span the Neolithic, the Bronze Age, the Classical World, the Roman Empire, the medieval period, and the early modern era. The earliest examples reach back many thousands of years, across Europe, the Near East, and beyond. The archaeologist Caroline Arsini of the Swedish National Heritage Board cataloged numerous prone burials across Europe and helped bring scholarly attention to the practice. The pattern is genuinely global, recorded in some form on every inhabited continent. But what did it mean? Here the evidence offers several answers, and they are not mutually exclusive. One interpretation is practical within the logic of fear. If you lay a dangerous corpse face down, then should it ever wake and try to claw its way out, it will dig downward, deeper into the earth, instead of up toward the surface and the living. A second interpretation is social. Prone burial could be a mark of punishment, shame, or exclusion, a final insult to someone who had transgressed. A third is protective, a way of shielding the living from a person feared in death. Crucially, prone burial rarely appears alone. It often coincides with the other markers we have seen: binding of the limbs, weighting with stones, decapitation, or placement at the very edge of a cemetery, away from the respectable dead. Some prone individuals were criminals, or those who died dishonorably. Others were suspected revenants, witches, or carriers of disease. Roman prone burials are documented across the empire, including in Britain, and medieval examples stretch from Britain to Eastern Europe. The meaning, then, was always context-dependent, never one single universal belief. And yet, the practice itself is so widespread that it serves as the common denominator, linking all the dramatic cases we have explored. A sickle, a padlock, a stake, a brick in the mouth, these are specialized tools of fear. But turning the body face down is the baseline instinct. The simplest way to say that this death was abnormal, and this person should not return. With these 10 cases laid out, a deeper pattern begins to emerge, one we can now examine directly. Step back from the individual graves, and a coherent toolkit of containment comes into focus, a kind of grammar of fear written in iron, stone, and earth. Each method had its own logic, yet all served the same end, to keep the dead from returning. The sickle across the throat threatened decapitation if the body rose. The padlock on a toe or limb, as at Pień, bound the spirit and symbolically closed the door of death. Stones or bricks forced into the mouth, as at Kilteasheen and Venice, trapped the soul or stopped the corpse from feeding. The iron stake through the chest, seen at Sozopol, pinned the body to the grave. Heavy stones and broken amphorae piled on the head and feet, as at Kamarina, simply weighed the corpse down. The bent nails of Sagalassos ritually fixed the danger in place, while the brick tiles and lime plaster sealed the grave like a lid. Decapitation and the repositioning of skulls at Čelákovice disabled the body's ability to move at all, and prone positioning disoriented the corpse so that it would dig the wrong way. Look closely, and the recurring elements jump out. Iron appears across cultures as a protective material, repelling the supernatural. Everyday farm tools, sickles, and plowshares were repurposed into instruments of restraint, the implements of life turned against the dead. The logic is consistent everywhere, physical restraint paired with symbolic binding, and often multiple methods were combined in a single grave, as at Pień with its sickle and padlock, or Čelákovice with its decapitation, waiting, and prone burial together. What unites them is intent. These graves contain few rich grave goods, because containment, not honor, was the goal. The same human fear was expressed in dozens of independent material languages, clustering by region but sharing one underlying purpose. These physical signatures are exactly what allow bioarchaeologists to identify deviant burials today, centuries later. Read together, the toolkit reveals a remarkably coherent, cross-cultural way of thinking, belief translated directly into the engineering of the grave. But to understand why these communities believed the dead could rise at all, we have to look at what they actually saw when they opened a grave. The single greatest source of the belief in the undead was something entirely natural, the process of decomposition itself, misread by people who had no science to explain it. Consider what a body does after death. Gases build up inside, bloating the corpse so that it looks plump and well-fed, as if it had been eating. A dark fluid, called purge fluid, can seep from the nose and mouth, and to a frightened observer, it looks exactly like fresh blood. As the skin dries and retracts, the teeth and fingernails appear to have grown longer, giving the impression of continued life. Now imagine the setting in which people encountered these signs. During an epidemic, mass graves were reopened again and again to add new bodies. A gravedigger lifting the cover would see a corpse that was bloated, bloody at the mouth, with seemingly grown nails and teeth, and a burial shroud that had sunk and torn as if chewed. To a person with no concept of bacteria or decay chemistry, there was only one explanation. This corpse was not truly dead. It was feeding. It was spreading the sickness. The pattern of disease itself reinforced the fear. Epidemics often struck families in clusters, one death following another in the same household, which looked exactly as if the first corpse were calling its relatives into the grave. At Lugnano, it was malaria. At Drawsko, possibly cholera. At Venice, the plague. Centuries later, in 19th century New England, the wasting of tuberculosis would fuel a fresh wave of vampire panics and exhumations. In every case, a real and invisible contagion was given a visible body to blame. Modern forensic taphonomy, the study of how bodies decay, now explains every single one of these vampire signs through ordinary biology. Researchers like Barini and Gregorica have used this science to reframe the folklore, not to mock it, but to recover the logic behind it. And that logic was, in its way, rational. Faced with an invisible killer, and armed only with what their eyes told them, these communities built an explanatory framework, the undead, and a method to fight it, sealing the grave. Necrophobia was a kind of proto-epidemiology, a fear that was also an attempt to understand. Understanding the biology dissolves the monster, but it deepens our respect for the people who faced it. And those people, it turns out, lived almost everywhere. Lay all the evidence out on a map, and something remarkable appears. The fear of the returning dead respects no borders. In Poland, we find the sickle and padlock burials of Pień and Drawsko. In Bulgaria, more than 100 staked graves of the Sozopol type line the historical record. In the Czech lands, Čelákovice offers its concentrated cemetery of decapitated and weighted dead. In Italy, the malaria child of Lugnano and the plague brick of Venice mark the practice across more than 1,000 years. The map only widens from there. In Greece and Sicily, Kamarina's weighted classical burials carry the fear back into antiquity. In Turkey, the nailed and sealed Roman grave at Sagalassos shows it in an urban imperial setting. In Ireland and Britain, the mouthstones of Kilteasheen and scattered Roman-prone graves extend it to the western edge of Europe. Across the Atlantic, in 19th century New England, tuberculosis drove communities to exhume and exorcise their own dead. And prone and weighted burials appear in China, in Africa, and in the Americas as well. The timeline is just as vast as the geography, running from the Neolithic all the way to the 19th century. What is striking is that many of these cultures were entirely independent of one another, yet they arrived at strikingly similar solutions. The folklore gave the monster different names: the Upior in Poland, the Upir in Bohemia, the Vrikolakas in Greece, the Nachtseher in the German lands. But beneath the names lay one shared anxiety: that the dead might not stay dead. Some of these motifs surely spread through trade and migration, carried along the same routes as goods and languages. Others almost certainly arose independently, the same fear generating the same response in cultures that never met. And Christianity, far from erasing these practices, often simply absorbed them, with clergy at times participating in the rites. The resulting map shows dense clusters, but no true blank spaces, and the fear tracks closely with disease, with war, and with social stress. Necrophobia, in other words, is very nearly a human universal. The diversity of methods only underlines the depth of the fear. Yet for all we have learned, the sealed graves still guard a great many secrets. For all the progress of recent decades, the archaeology of the sealed grave is full of open questions. We do not fully understand why some communities chose to stake their dead, while others used sickles, stones, or simple reversal of the body. The specific beliefs behind each method often went unrecorded, leaving us to reconstruct them from the bones alone. Many deviant burials come with no written context whatsoever, only the silent testimony of the grave. There is a deeper uncertainty too. We rarely know whether a particular individual was singled out because of who they were, or whether the burial was simply precautionary, a just-in-case measure applied to a death that felt wrong. The work at Drawsko, where isotope analysis proved the feared dead were locals rather than outsiders, is a powerful reminder that our assumptions can be completely mistaken. Ancient DNA may one day reveal whether the feared dead shared particular traits, illnesses, or family ties, but that research is only beginning. The line between criminal punishment and revenant fear remains genuinely blurry. A person buried face down with bound limbs might have been a feared vampire, an executed criminal, or both at once, since the categories overlapped in the medieval mind. Some so-called deviant positions may even be accidental, the result of a hasty burial, rather than a deliberate ritual, and telling the difference is not always possible. Dating individual burials precisely is its own challenge, and the role of clergy versus folk practitioners is far from settled. Other questions hang in the air. How widely did the shroud-eater belief really spread? Were children, like the boy at Lugnano, feared differently from adults? What role did raw grief play in these rituals, alongside fear? The field keeps shifting as new sites emerge, like the child found at Pień in 2023, each discovery reshaping the picture rather than completing it. Museums now debate how to display these remains ethically, and the re-examination of old collections with modern methods keeps yielding fresh evidence. Many skeletons still sit in storage, never studied with the tools we now possess. Each new grave adds nuance rather than a final answer. The field is young, and the dead still hold their secrets close. In the end, every one of these sealed graves is a message left behind by people facing something they could not explain. The methods differ from one another: sickle or stake, brick or stone, padlock or simple reversal of the body. But the impulse beneath them is always the same: the need to contain a threat that felt utterly real. These were tombs sealed against the dead, not against grave robbers, a crucial distinction that changes how we read them entirely. What the graves record is fear, yes, but also something gentler, the desire to protect the living, and often to manage overwhelming grief. The supposed monster was almost never a stranger. It was a neighbor, a family member, a sick child, someone who had been loved and was now feared. Disease, loss, and the unknown drove these communities to act, and they acted with the only tools and knowledge they had. Science can now explain the bloating, the blood at the mouth, the seeming growth of hair and nails, without any need for the supernatural. And yet the human response at the heart of it remains deeply recognizable. We still ritualize death, still build practices to manage the part of mortality we cannot control. These graves are honest documents of pre-scientific reasoning, belief turned into iron, stone, and earth. Bioarchaeology lets us recover that fear without mocking the people who felt it, and in doing so, it makes the past more human, not less. The farmer of the Neolithic and the plague-era gravedigger of Venice are joined across the millennia by the same anxiety and the same desperate ingenuity. The dead were sealed in to keep the world safe, from one end of the old world to the other, and across thousands of years. When we open these graves today, we are not really looking at monsters. We are looking at people, at their love and their terror, and their attempts to make sense of death. The sealed tomb turns out to be a mirror, reflecting our own anxieties back at us. And so we are left with the question these graves were built to answer. The oldest question there is, what exactly is it that we fear when we close the earth over someone we have lost?